And with that, Marsha, welcome back to Nova Scribes. It's great to have you back again. What do you have for us tonight?
Yeah, thanks, Brian. With that intro, I feel like I would just say I had a similar experience when I ran into structural dynamics. So it's been um, probably over about 17 years ago now. And it changed how I think about and see dynamics in the room. And it has become really a sole focus for us at Team Catapult. So I work with individual leaders, I coach teams, and we also coach facilitators and coaches in how to use this framework really for anything. But I think about it as how do you work with the tension that exists just naturally when humans are speaking with one another? And I also think that there are so many things that happen where project goes sideways, an organization doesn't get funding, or a startup doesn't get funding, you have a fallout with a colleague, and somebody departs. All of that can be told in both a moral story, where I'm right and someone else is wrong, or it can be told in a structural story, which is what was the structure of what was happening, what was missing, and how could we have changed the nature of that conversation. So my intent today is I want to give you just a tiny slice of what that might look like. And we're going to start with like one piece of the model. So that's where we're going to go. Yeah.
Okay.
Brian's sharing all kinds of lovely data in the chat for you.
Would you like me to share the link that you shared with me earlier? You
Yes,
ready for that?
please. Yeah.
Okay, here we go.
So I don't have slides because I'd really like to keep this interactive. I have some pieces that I definitely want to share with you, but I'd really love to hear your voices in this process too. So I've got some prompts. I'll just invite you to, if you have questions as we go, just signal and raise your hand and come in. Like bring your experience, bring your question. That'll keep it a little bit more alive. The link that Brian shared with you is just a PDF. And if you go and download it from the Google Drive and just save it to your desktop, yes, it'll look like that. If you save it to your desktop, it's an editable PDF. So there are places where I'll, along the way, where I might say, just reflect or think about this. And you can do it right in the doc. And of course, you can handwrite it in your journal, or you're a visual practitioner, so you might scribe it on your digital board that you have going on. So that's a little bit of what we're going to do tonight, and I'd love to, yeah, we'll keep it interactive. Get Brian with the fancy share. Um, there was a study last year published. It was about July last year, published by an organization called ZipDo on conflict. And what they found is that 80% of employees at all levels experience some degree of conflict in the workplace, and that 60 to 80% of difficulties in organizations come from strained relationships. So what I have discovered, I think, over time working with so many people and talking about the way we communicate is one is I think that most of us would tell you that we communicate well because we do it all day long. So I think there's this natural inherent view that we are good. Like I don't necessarily need to learn about how to communicate. I'm good. It's the other person that's really in my way or causing me a lot of difficulty. So I think that's an interesting um, bend that I find. And the other thing about that statistic is that I think for many of us, we might not describe some of the friction or the tension actually as conflict, especially in the moment. I think we are really practiced at something going a little sideways. And then we just sort of have this internal dialogue where we go, it's fine, suck it up, keep moving. We need to get this thing done. Maybe it's just me, it's not, them, or it's enough of a friction that we get off of a meeting or a call or leave a meeting, and then we want to go tell our friend, either on the ride home or over dinner one night. you'll never believe what so-and-so did in this meeting. And so I think we process it that way, but it's really these, what I've started to call micro moments, where over time, if we don't make sense of them or make meaning of them or do something to intervene in them, they start to build up. And I think that's where the tension builds. I think that's where misunderstanding, misalignment, and conflict really emerge. So that's what we're going to talk about today. My hope is to give you a framework to look at least one level of that. And I hope you'll leave here tonight with some action or takeaway that you want to just try. So I think the best way to get started is to find a doorway in and then get going. So startling, yeah.
Oh, appreciate that. I just
Yeah.
want to make sure I capture. You said it's the micro tensions that build up and create strain in the. Can you
Yeah.
repeat that for me? Because I thought that was just such a
Yeah.
good piece.
So, we talk about, so the statistics are, 60 to 80% of interactions or cause difficulties in organizations. But I think these really boil down to what I call micro moments. And it is these micro moments that a lot of us brush off, step aside, step over, and we do it. It's a little bit like it's the water we're swimming in. We'll say things like, well, that's just how we do it around here, whether I like it or not. That's what I've come to expect. And I think it's those micro moments. Sometimes they're a little bit like dust particles that you just sweep under the rug and say you'll get to it later. And eventually, I think the rug gets so big, especially on a team, the rug gets so big you can't open the door anymore. And then we don't understand why small things feel so difficult. Or we're trying to make a forward progress on something and it's like being stuck in the mud. Like we keep repeating the same conversation over and over again, expecting a different result, but we haven't, it's the stuff under the rug that we've been ignoring for a really long time. So I think about them as micro moments. And I don't know that we would describe them as conflict without some reflection. So that's my hypothesis. See what you think as we go through today. So I'm going to give you some language and we're going to break it down. But yeah, just test that to see how you think about it. Okay, and definitely my hope is that you'll take some actions away from today. So in the PDF that Brian shared, there is, if you turn to page, there's some preamble that you don't have to worry about. But if you turn to page 5, there should be some blank space. Yes, it looks just like that. So take a moment to think about, what is the behavior that challenges you the most when it shows up in the room? So you can jot notes in the PDF, but you'll need to have downloaded it. If you're accessing it from the Google Drive, the editable field won't work, or you can just make some notes. But take just a minute to think about, what's the behavior that challenges you the most when it shows up in the room? Everybody have one, or the makings of one? I'll share mine with you, and then I'd love to have you share yours if you're up for it. So you could either do it in the chat or you could come off mute and share it. But so I'll share mine. I have two primary ones, but one of them is particularly if I'm a participant in a conversation, one of the behaviors that will really challenge me is when the conversation moves at such a fast pace. It's hard for me to get a word in edgewise. And it is stacked up with multiple topics. So you can think about, like somebody will toss out a question and say, we should think about the complexities, around this particular thing. And then someone else says, yes. And I think about, a time where this happened. And all of a sudden it can be 10 or 15 minutes. And I'll notice that what's happened for me is my brain is still on the first question because I'm going, yeah, what complexities? And, I think about this complexity and it means something. And yet there are 7 or 8 other topics that have now made their way into the conversation. And I can't be present with them because I'm still back on the first one and there are, 7 or 10 other things. So that is one behavior that challenges me. A second behavior that challenges me, so this is a bit more if I'm facilitating or leading in some way, is that when I have a pretty strong like spidey sense about what's happening in a group, and I can overly pay attention to dynamics if I think that there is a point of view or an opinion that's being held back and not said. So I will describe it in those moments as it feels like there's disagreement, but it's not being spoken about, and I can really overly pay attention to it as facilitator. So those are 2 for me. I'm curious about anybody who would be willing to share. I'd love to hear yours. Anyone up for it?
Nancy?
I said people who are unwilling to share what they really think in the meeting and then have conversations afterward with 1 or 2 people expressing their disagreement or dissatisfaction with a decision, for example, that the team made.
Yes. Yeah. I hear you. How about thanks, Nancy. How about somebody else?
I mean, I've got one while we're waiting for folks. No, Kathy, go ahead.
Yeah.
I had one in there that was folks who are just keep speaking louder to get a viewpoint heard without working to understand all the viewpoints in the room.
Yep. Tim, side conversations. Yep. Sets that are shared privately, not in the group. Yeah, that's a theme here for sure. Not feeling listened to. Yeah.
I wrote people in positions of power setting precedences that may not be actionable by everybody in the room.
I can feel that one. Yeah, so these are great. So just make some notes of them because we're going to come back to them. You're going to have an opportunity to come back to them as we go through. And just pay attention to, even as somebody else shares one that's true for them, you might find yourself going, yes, and that too. Because there will likely be multiple things that really start to take our conversations to a place of being less effective rather than more effective, which is where we get the best out of groups and teams. Okay, so the other thing to know about what we just did is you might label this as the moral story. And I'll come back and I'll say more about that a little bit later. But these are the versions of what's happening where I like to say everybody loves a moral story. So they will often come. It's the version that you would tell your friend, right? These people were being such jerks because they were talking or they were, having a sidebar conversation that was so rude. And then they took it offline and they deprived the whole group of everything. And I found it to be really disorienting. So the moral story, just so you really live into it, has a lot of judgment in it. So it's okay. That's the version of the story. And we'll come back to that a little bit later. In your workbook, you can turn to page 6, and I just say I want to layer in a little bit about the theory of structural dynamics. This comes from David Cantor. He's an organizational psychologist. He did quite a bit of research. So some of the research that sits behind this theory started in the early to late 70s. He was at Harvard and started looking at what makes conversations effective. So he did in situ home recordings where he placed tape recorders and Harvard students inside homes and recorded the conversation all day, every day. So that was really what laid the foundation of this, and what emerged from those early studies with structural dynamics. So it's a theory of face-to-face communication and how communication works and does not work. And so one of the biggest kind of findings in that theory is that there are two realities in every conversation. There is the visible reality, and then there is the invisible reality, the least visible. And so conversations become really tricky when our intent doesn't match our words, and then also when it doesn't match the impact that we're having. So many times we think we are communicating in one way when really we're doing something else. Yes, bless your heart. So when people say things to you, it feels like it has a different intent than how it sounds. That's part of the way that you start to notice the invisible reality taking shape. So those things that we think, but maybe we don't say, they still impact in many ways. And what structural dynamics attempts to do is make the invisible more visible. Because when we do that, then we stand a better chance at changing the nature or the outcome of the conversation. When the invisible is left to be under the rug or under the surface, it is where it does the most harm. So several of you have said when conversations go offline, that is a way that the invisible reality actually plays out. We take conversations offline, we go say what we really think, and we actually deprive the whole group of that conversation. So it's one of the ways that we can get a little sideways. I think about structural dynamics as a kind of technology. So if you flip into page 7, you'll see the 4 levels of structural dynamics. So I think about this as a technology for describing what's happening in the conversation or the structure of the conversation. So I know there are many, 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 many models that you could take a self-assessment for, and it'll tell you you're this color, or it'll tell you you're this letter. I would just ask you to take all of the experience that you have of those things, because they absolutely have a role and a purpose and they're valuable, and just put them to the side. Because in structural dynamics, we are looking at not like your identity or who you might be, but we are looking at the actions that are happening live in the conversation. So I can make a move in closed power, and that will describe 3 levels of the sentence that I've just spoken. It'll encapture the action, it'll encompass the vocabulary, the language that I'm using, and it'll talk about the way I'm orienting to you as a group. So we use structure as a way to kind of code what's happening live, and as a way to tell us where things are working and where things are not. So just very briefly, the level 1 action modes, those are where we're going to focus tonight. And this is what Brian was talking about. So this is the most popular, the most known level of structural dynamics is it's often called the 4-player model, or the action modes. And there are 4 of them: move, follow, oppose, and bystand. So I'll go into those in just a little bit. But you can think about actions as they kind of point or set direction in a conversation. So moves, point us in one way, follows, support it, opposes, say, stop, no. So actions are a little bit like direction. The second level is operating systems, and this is a lot more about how we orient to one another. So if I'm I could make a hypothesis that in this group, we might take a preference or have a preference for being in more open system. So that's hearing all voices, collaboration. Every time I toss a question out to you all and say, what do you think? Or would someone like to share? That's me making a move in open system. For some of you, you might like it. For some people, they don't like it. And so there might be a difference in operating system. So closed operating system, I could say, take out your books and turn to page 7. I'm not asking, I'm just suggesting that that's what you do. And then random system is about autonomy. It's the place of invention, creation, new thinking. So these are the ways that we orient to others. The level 3 is communication domains, and this is the language that we use. So I can speak in power, and you'll find me talking about things like taking action. I can speak in affect, and I'm placing my attention or my focus on people. So care and concern for others will be the language of affect. And then in meaning, I will be focused on the data. Why? What's the context? What's important about this? So I'm often that space of speaking and meaning is about depth. It's searching for understanding. What's the right or wrong way to do this? Why would we do it? Those are the kinds of things, if I were speaking in meaning, that I would say. And then the last level, and David would say the most influential of all 4, is what he calls childhood stories. And this is things that get laid down for us from the age of about 2 all the way to 23 that set us up for how we behave the way we do even as adults. And there will be structures to those formative stories that impact levels 1, 2, and 3 in terms of what we prefer or dislike or even don't have a tolerance for at all. And there's a way that we can tell the structure of those just by looking at structural dynamics. So David would say the most influential on our behavior gets laid down in that childhood level, which is kind of fascinating. I'll pause real quickly just to see if there's any questions coming up. Otherwise, we'll dive into the first level. Nope. All right, so let's start with level 1. And you can read a little bit more about them on page 8. So if you want to understand a bit more about each level, much of what I said is on page 8. But let's move on to page 9, and you'll see the infamous 4-player model diamond. So what the 4-player model says is that everything that we say can be coded into one of 4 actions, which I think is actually kind of fascinating. I found that a little bit hard to believe at first. I was like, really? And so the answer to that is, I would say yes, they can. And it can take a little bit of practice just getting used to thinking about structure in that way. So thinking about the way we speak to one another and the actions, the move action really sets direction, so it points. So I keep making moves by saying, let's move on to this topic. Moves, you can think about every time a topic changes in a conversation, that is often a move. So if somebody were to say, yeah, I'm really curious about how this relates to the Myers-Briggs test, that's another move in our conversation because it's shifting topics. It's pointing in a different direction. So moves set direction in the conversation. A follow gets behind and completes or supports something that's been spoken in the conversation. So follows can support moves. I can get behind Brian and say, yes, I agree with that. But follows can also support opposes. So somebody could say, I disagree with what Brian just said. And someone else could come along and say, I do too. I share that concern. So follow gets behind and supports something that's being said. Oppose offers a clear correction. It says, no, stop, hold on, time out, not this way. I have a different perspective, or I see it differently. So it's offering a lens or a correction. David would often talk about it as being a correction that's happening in the frame of the conversation. And then the fourth one is a bystand. So the bystand is a morally neutral comment on what's happening. So I can bystand on myself and say, I'm noticing I'm confused in this conversation. I'm owning that. I'm not for or against anything that anybody's saying. I'm just naming something. By another bystand might be, I notice that we've, seems like we're stuck, or it seems like we've got 4 topics on the table. I'm wondering which one we want to explore. So bystands can bridge. If you've ever had somebody say, it seems like you're in violent disagreement, I'm hearing you say this and you say this, and it sounds like there's a common theme here, that can be actually a very powerful bystand in a group conversation. So where this becomes really helpful is a couple of things to note. These are actions. So I'm very clear about refraining from calling people movers or followers. Like I really stick with, oh, somebody made a move, somebody made a follow, because it is an action that you're taking. The move and oppose is what brings in advocacy to the conversation, and bystand and follow brings inquiry. So it brings curiosity, questions, more inquiry, or wanting to, the follow and bystand can help a group kind of get underneath the topic that they're talking about. And things go sideways when one or more of these is missing. So all of these are active. I know sometimes it can be easy to think about this, particularly bystand, as because we use the word bystander for somebody who's sort of standing off on the side and not intervening. That's not what it's meant as here. It just means it's the vocal act. And sometimes if somebody has fallen back in the conversation or is not as active, they can offer. Sometimes they have a bigger perspective that they can offer. So getting somebody like that to voice a bystand can be really helpful, because they often see a lot more about what's happening in the conversation. So we need all 4 of these to be active in a conversation in order for the conversation to be effective. So that's, oops. Brian, did I just mess up your video?
No, I decided to spotlight both of ours just so it's
Okay,
better for the recording.
perfect. Okay. Yep, so we need all 4 of them to be voiced and active in the conversation in order for the conversation to be effective. So let's take a moment. You'll find an example on page 10 in your workbook, just so that you have a sense of what it sounds like if it's voiced. So you'll see there a move says, in this meeting, let's talk about the new product launch date. That's a move, it's setting direction. The oppose, somebody might say, I disagree that we're getting tight on time. We still have 3 more weeks to make the decision on the launch date. A follow might sound like, I agree. I think we need to define the launch date soon. We're getting really tight on time. And then a bystand might sound like, we have 2 different points of view here to view about the timeline. From your perspective, what's tight about the timeline right now? So that's just to give you a brief definition and an example. And now what I'd like you to do, if you turn to page 11, don't go further, but let's just start here and take a moment to see what you can do about coding a very short conversation that's happening here about Charlie and Devin and Peyton wanting to go get coffee, and see if you can decide which is a move, a follow, an oppose, or a bystand. So take just a minute, and if you've got it downloaded, you should be able to have that editable field to the right there. And when you're done, you can, yeah, it's nice to meet you, Yvette. You can flip to the next page, which has answers on it. So when you're ready, just take a look and see how you did.
Okay, I have a question for you.
Okay.
Can you explain how I need to finish a report? It should take me about 20 minutes is a follow.
Yes. So a lot of times what matters in coding the conversation is kind of the context and the sequence for which it's happened. So we think about Charlie said, let's go get coffee. Devin says, there's a new coffee shop. So he's suggesting it's a support. Peyton says, I can't right now, which becomes an oppose. And then what Devin comes back and says is what's happening right now. So Peyton says, I can't right now. And Devin goes, well, what's happening right now? So it's an inquiry into the oppose that's been made. And then Peyton comes back and says, look, I need to finish a report. It should take me about 20 minutes. So what he's saying in the way that he's saying it is, yes, I can go, and I need just a few more minutes in order to be able to go. So there's a request as part of that follow, but it's a support to yes. And this is what that would look like for me. And so then Charlie comes with a new move and says, well, given that, then let's go in an hour. And then there's Frankie. So I'll just call that out about when someone has been silent. They are none of the above. So it's very tempting. It gets back to like how we use the word bystander for other things. But in this particular instance, unless somebody's speaking, they're not making any action. So we'd only know what action they're making if they're talking. Otherwise, they're silent and we don't know what they're thinking. If somebody's asking about a guide on coding conversations, can you say a little bit more about the guide or what would be helpful? Yeah, there you go.
My question was, so for the coding bit, taking like a super like scientific approach to it, right? If you code it or you miscode it, then that can change your approach after, right? So like if someone were to misinterpret, kind of like when we were talking about the follow and stuff,
Yes.
then that could lead to different outcomes.
It could. And here's what I'd say about that right now, given where you're at thinking about structure and coding conversations. I don't hold the belief that it's super important to get every single line item correct. Now, if you are high in meaning, that my saying that might drive you a little crazy. But I say that because what's most important, especially as you're facilitating or coaching a team, is that you pick up on patterns. So we're not going to intervene in a conversation, over one or two, sentences that we sort of get wrong if we're mentally coding a conversation. What we're looking for is patterns, and that's what I'm going to talk about next. Because what's important is that we know coding well enough to spot patterns. So what I would be looking for in this conversation would be, Peyton who, says the follow, and there's a lot of words to that follow. So, does Peyton find himself sort of stuck in follow? And does that come at, every time in a conversation, is he doing follow over and over again? That's what's going to stand out for me. That's where I'm going to get curious. So it's not going to be the fact that it showed up once in the conversation. Actually, I'm looking for balance, but I'm also looking for patterns. And then, yes, the book that, Brian, did you put the Read the Room book?
I did. And
Yeah.
I think Rachel's got a question for you in chat too.
Yeah, what about nodding or shaking your head? That's a good question. So I have a rule with teams where I really, maybe it's a principle, not a rule. I really like to ask teams to get into the practice of voicing rather than relying on body language or silence. So, if we had, there's been a little bit of it here. Like as I was talking earlier, some of you were smiling and shaking your head. Like I could assume that it was resonating for you or that you too have had, a similar experience. But I think it's a dangerous assumption. Like my job, if I'm really paying attention to inquiry, advocacy and inquiry, if I really wanted to know where I thought it was important, I might just pause and say, so I see a couple people nodding. Can you say just a little bit about what that's about? Maybe one or two people speak, and then I'm really checking, is there anybody that sees it differently? So that's me making my way around the 4-player model, looking for people to voice. Because I think a lot of times, and especially in this online world that we live in these days, where everybody goes to emojis and thumbs up, and it's a lot of, we're jumping over a lot of context that I think we start to miss. So it's not like a rule, but sometimes I'll just ask a team to get in the habit of saying, I support that because, rather than tech teams are really infamous for this with the +1 and the and the thumbs up, and I'm like, you're thumbs upping what? So sometimes the thing that somebody's following, the thing that I might follow behind what Brian just said might be different than what Kathy might follow behind what Brian just said. Like we might be agreeing with Brian for slightly different reasons. And if we're thinking about creating a space for more dialogue with the team, for deeper understanding, the principle here is to get that to be voiced. Sometimes that takes time or norm setting. So it's a great question, Rachel. Okay, let's look at patterns. So we need all 4 actions. They need to be voiced in order to be coded. And we get into trouble as humans when one or more of those actions goes missing in conversations over time. So teams will fall into a fairly, about 5 common patterns when they get sort of stuck in conversations. So on page 13, you'll see the first one is what we call serial moving. So that is the place, that's one of mine where I said, there will be 7 topics in the first 10 minutes and my brain is back on topic number 1 and the conversation has moved on to topic number 7. Teams that have this pattern will have a lot of energy to their conversations. So it'll feel a little bit like juggling balls in the air, except what happens is the ball gets tossed in the air and it doesn't get picked up. It just sort of drops to the floor and rolls up in the corner. And then someone else enters a new topic. And now there's another topic. And all of a sudden, you'll leave these meetings and you'll go, we talked about a lot. I am not sure who's doing what. I don't know any depth. I don't think we understood or agreed on anything. We just talked about a lot. So if you ever have that experience or that feeling, check for how often are people making moves that don't get followed or opposed vocally, right? So this is what gets tricky. If we just, if I say, let's go to lunch, and we'll head down to the shop at 11:30 and nobody says anything, do I assume that people are going with me or so I think when we don't have the verbal follow behind, it just leaves a lot of assumption for everybody about what's happening. So serial moving, lots of energy, but it will be missing what? Like, what's the action you'd want to bring in if you noticed there were lots of moves on the table?
A bystander? A bystand.
Bystand could be helpful, right? So you could say, I noticed we've got 7 moves on the table. So that might be, the bystand might be a way, especially if you're kind of leading that conversation, the bystand might be a doorway into prompting, but ultimately what I'm going to be prompting the group for is the follow. Yeah, Kathy. Because there are so many moves, what's really needed next is a follow. Somebody needs to pick a topic, and then we need to hold off on the others. And so a way into that might be to say, I noticed there's 5 topics. We've talked about this, 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 and this, which is the one. So this would be an open system, which is the one that you want to explore next. Or I can make a move and close system and say, I think we need to talk about topic number 1 first. So it's looking for the follow behind one of the moves. The next one is courteous compliant. So this is where agreement seems easy. Somebody makes a move, and then there's a whole bunch of vocal or maybe implied follow behind it. It might sound like, yes, sure, sounds good. But what's missing from this one? What's missing the most, I should say. Yeah. Yeah, for sure. So courteous compliance is we're lacking somebody pushing back or challenging or offering a different perspective or opinion. And that's really what's needed. So for somebody to voice, like, where might we be wrong, or what's at risk here? Those might be bystands that would prompt for more of an oppose in the conversation. So point counterpoint, if you flip to page 14, this is when we have move and oppose. So we've got the move and we've got the oppose, but we're stuck in this place. Has anybody ever been in the room when this happens? It's fun. Yeah. So what do we do here? With teenagers. Yeah, teenagers, at least my teenager, I said I never wanted her to feel like her voice wasn't valued or that she couldn't oppose us. And I have lived that principle. Yeah, so I get opposed. It's sort of be careful what you ask for, but I definitely get opposed. So in structural dynamics, what we need most in this kind of locked debate is we need follow and bystand. So what's happening here is, if somebody said, look, I want to take all of our PCs and make them max, that's my move. And somebody else said, we are not doing that. Absolutely not going to happen. So clear move and clear oppose. But if nothing else gets said or happens in that conversation, the two of those individuals aren't going anywhere. So what's needed, and actually what structural dynamics says actually makes an effective oppose, is to start with follow and bystand first. And every time I say that, it comes with this yellow flag warning. This is not me giving you an artificial formula to follow every time you get in an argument with somebody. My yellow flag warning is this needs to be genuine. Like you need to find your way into that conversation that is genuine, that also starts with a follow and bystand. So if somebody's saying to me, we need to change out all the Macs to PCs, a better way for me to oppose them is to find the thing that they are saying that I can follow and support first. So if I completely disagree with most of it, what I can do is find a value. So I could say, you know what, I share your value of staying up to date with technology. That is also true for me. My bystand might be, I'm noticing that would be extremely costly, and it feels like it would also be disruptive to what we're doing. So my oppose would be, I disagree completely with doing it all at once and doing it in a mass way that spends a lot of money. My new move would be, we could do it, 5 at a time, or we could do it a half a department at a time, and we could look at, cost, doing it twice a year. But ultimately what I'm doing is I am finding something that I agree with. I'm also bringing the context or the perspective that I see. And I will tell you this from my own experience. So oppose in my own behavioral profile was my least used action. And so it has become and been my work to do, to really work at bringing my oppose. And what I discovered about that whole process is that a lot of times I would say no, or I would push back on something, and I really wasn't sure exactly what I would follow and why, like what was the context behind why I was pushing back. So even just going through the process of building my muscle around oppose and thinking about, okay, what is it about this that I am having such a reaction to? What can I agree with? What is the bigger context that I see? It was really helpful for me to begin to think about what are the nuances about the idea that I'm really pushing back against, and can I be specific about them? So can I find the very specific thing that I am disagreeing with and state it clearly? I disagree with doing it all at once. I disagree with, spending that kind of money. I disagree with the disruption of it. And then also, can I make a new move? So for some people, they will be very well versed in oppose. My daughter is one of them. So she does not have to work on building her muscle of oppose. But often what people who bring oppose really well have to work on is what's the new move, not just the pushback, but what's the idea. So sometimes that just requires a bit of prompting. So effective opposes start with follow and bystand, and then they are very clear about what's the suggested new move. The last one, so I'll come back to covert opposition. The last one on page 14 is Hall of Mirrors. And this is, if you think about a team that bystands a lot, so this might be a team that sort of gets stuck in noticing. They notice that this department's, yeah, engineers definitely do this. This department needs this. I'm not getting this from over here. Up above is not providing the direction that we need. So sometimes it can sound a lot like complaining or venting. That can be a lot of bystanding or noticing. Some teams are just really good at, I see this and I see this pattern and I see this pattern. But what's needed when that hall of mirrors shows up is somebody actually needs to make a move. So the prompt becomes, all right, so given this, now what? What do you want to do? How do you want to bring that forward? What's the move that you would make that would address all of the things that you keep seeing? So teams can get really stuck in the bystanding. And then this last one is called covert opposition. So if you have serial moving or courteous compliance or hall of mirrors, you also have covert opposition. So for those of you who checked in with the behavior of things get said offline versus in the room, that's also a good indicator that you have covert opposition at play. And here's here is how that shows up. When opposition cannot be voiced for whatever reason inside of a large group, it has to get voiced in some way. So that serial moving pattern, if I don't feel like I can oppose you, either that's my work or we have, it's not a safe environment, or the last time I opposed you, it didn't go so well for me, so I'm not going to do it again. But something has transpired. So if I can't directly tell you that I disagree, I'll just change the subject. I thought you're laughing. I'll just change the subject. Or I will tell you, sure, just tell me what you want me to do. I will voice the follow, but that is not what I intend. What I intend is no. And I'll tell somebody else that offline when we get done here. But I'll tell you, sure, just tell me what you want me to do here. Or the bystand happens where if I don't feel like I can oppose you, I'll frame it in a question. So a bystand might sound like, why have we not considered other options? Like you can tell that it's like, I don't think that's truly a neutral question. It feels like it's got a bit of a agenda behind it, or an unspoken move. So anytime you have those hits, what's happening is we're saying one thing, but we intend another. And in my experience, that is the crux. That's the micro moment where things go off the rails. And I think it's really stealth. I think teams are so practiced at it. I think we humans are really practiced at doing the other action that we've just learned over time is what gets us where we need to go. And then we just sweep it under the rug and keep moving. So these are the places where when the thing that we're speaking doesn't match our intent, now that invisible reality that I talked about a little while ago is starting to undermine the whole quality of our conversation. And it is what will have us repeat conversations. We'll get stuck. We'll make less quality decisions. We will have those unstated things that feel, and they just, the energy behind the conversation just feels off. It feels, you'll have different words that you use for it, right? It feels fake, or it feels artificial, or maybe it feels more technical or tactical, and we're not really talking about the real issue. It is often because something's happening in the conversation. So the patterns become, to this question about coding and can we, do we get it all right? I think getting coding is important, getting it fairly right is important, but really what we're doing coding for is we're using it so that we can find the pattern in the conversation. And the patterns are where we would start to intervene. So I just want to pause here because I've said a lot. So I'm wondering, for those of you that are listening, and I do see some of you nodding and laughing along the way, I would love to hear, I'd love to hear what's happening for you. What's going on as you hear all of this? What are you thinking about?
And I'll just say that we will get to how do you use this as a facilitator in about a page, right?
Yeah.
How is this falling on you? Yeah, Starling.
All right, so my question's with could you go to the Hall of Mirrors one?
Yeah.
And we might have touched on this. I was trying to think about, you have it should be the one below. Just go. You have a mover and then just a bunch of bystanders. I was thinking
Yes.
about like, okay, what might we introduce to the conversation to get out of that, and then the BBB. And I think my first thought was probably a follower, like a follower or opposer. Right? I think either one of those could work. I'm just thinking through, like, and maybe we're gonna touch. I'm just thinking through with the group, like, okay, hey, there's this great idea. Well, could they have this? Someone else says, well, this is also there. Oh, this is also there. Like, how do you build in some direction?
So when the Hall of Mirrors is at play, so both of, remember that yes, there will be unstated oppose. We can just assume that there's likely some pushback that's not being voiced when these patterns show up. But what will help the Hall of Mirrors first, like the action that's needed first in order to kind of intervene and change that pattern, is for somebody to make a move. So it's a little bit like we've collected all of the data, right? We've got all the observations, good or bad, whether they're complaints, we've spent 10 or 15 minutes complaining about the situation or noticing what's happening in this, at the strategy or outside at the stakeholder level. But the real prompt there is getting the group to make a move. So I hear you. Given all of that, what do you suggest? Or what do you want to do about it? Or how do you want to process all of this? So it's about the move will help break that hall of mirrors, so that there's a different, what happens with the move. So bystands become, it's not that you can't oppose a bystand, but it's harder. What happens in the bystanding when somebody actually does make a move, now we have something that people can react to. So now the group can say, yes, I agree, or no, I disagree. Does that make sense?
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah. What's happening for others? Or what are you thinking about as you hear all of this?
So I guess I'm going to ask Starling's question again because I'm still unclear, because there is a move up there in that model.
Yes.
So are you saying there should be another move that reacts to the bystanding?
Yes.
Bystands. Okay, great. Thanks.
Exactly.
That helps.
Yep.
Thank you.
Yep. Yeah, thanks for asking. All right. Let's talk a little bit about what do you do with all of this? And I think the best way into that will be, so if you turn to, let's see. You turn to page 16. Yep, Brian's got it. A way to get started in using structure. And so I would point you first to just sticking with the 4-player model. So don't worry about the other the levels of structural dynamics right now. But if you're just wanting to get started, to start with the 4-player model. And the first thing that you're going to want to do is work on your moral story. So if you turn to the next page, you'll see a couple of examples on page 17. And the notes that you took about the behavior that challenges you the most when it shows up, I want you to think about, I said we're gonna call that, or we're gonna label that the moral story, right? That's the one with all the judgment. The first task is to turn that moral story into a structural one. So even if you use the behavior that you used at the beginning of tonight, so I'll give you an example from me. So one of the stories that I shared with you, or the behaviors that I shared with you, is essentially when I said, the conversation starts, there are multiple things that happen, multiple topics that get introduced, and my brain is still back on the first one. That's a hard pattern for me. So if you think about what I've just said, can you now hear the structural version of that story? I'm referring to serial moving. So my moral story would be, here we go again. This is our pattern. This is what we do. Every time we start talking, there's constant topic changes. It's hard to keep up. Why has nobody answered the first question that we started out with? We always do this, and then we wonder why we never get done with anything in these conversations. So that's my moral version, okay? My structural story would be something very simple, which says our pattern is we get stuck in serial moving. And I notice that one person is stuck in making moves and the rest follow. And no one is actively offering an oppose or a bystand. And then my question to myself becomes, what role might I be playing in that? So for me, if I'm not watching, I can check out and become a passive participant, and that's not helpful. And what could I do differently? I could turn to my bystand. So if I can catch sight of that in the moment, what I could do is say, hold on, here we're in our pattern again. Yeah, I'm noticing we're in our pattern again, and we've introduced 6 topics. My brain is still back on the first one, which is preventing me from really hearing what you're talking about right now. And I care about what we're talking about. It's important to me. And it would be helpful for me if we go back to the first topic first. So that is me making a bystand and a move to go back to the first topic. So in this particular instance of me as a participant, I'm not asking. I'm actually making a request that we go back to the one that we were starting with. If I were facilitating, I would say that slightly differently. So I want you to take just a moment, and there's a blank page on page 18. And can you put your moral story that you checked in with into a structural story? Can you find a pattern in what you shared? And I'm here if you want to get some thinking help with it. So it would actually be great just to hear 1 or 2 of them, because it helps everybody learn.
Okay, I think I need some help.
Okay.
So my story was when people go below the line. I'm thinking about participants who tend to act inappropriately, violate ground rules, disrespect each other.
Yep. So what do you think is happening structurally?
I don't know. That's why I'm asking for help. That's a tough one.
So what's happening? What's the first thing that you said?
People go below the line. They act inappropriately. They violate ground rules. They disrespect each other.
And what does below the line mean?
So this is a kind of a ground rule that I do. I'll draw the line. I say, look, everybody, you know what the line is. Stay above the line, right? You shouldn't have to explain what the line is. You know, it's acting professionally. You know, it's staying above the line.
And then you notice people don't do that.
Yes.
So is it possible that you're making a move and others are opposing you?
Usually when I have to bring up the line, they've already decided to go there. They've decided to act unprofessionally, and it disappoints me that, you know, I even have to bring it into the space. This is usually an intervention by the time I'm talking about it.
Yeah. And do you see that though as structurally as an oppose on their behalf?
It could be, yeah. They could oppose whatever's happening in the room, the process, the direction, the decisions.
Yep. So is it possible that it might be a bit of point counterpoint, where there's a move around norms and then there's an oppose around norms? Yep.
Yeah, thank you.
Yeah, does that help?
Very much so, thanks.
Yeah. It's one of the things, it's a great example, Brian, because one of the things that's important in telling the structural story is finding, so it does require us to drop the judgy parts that we will just naturally have about it, and can we tell the structure? And the topic, we also have to kind of drop the topic that it's about, right? So Brian, in your case, it's possibly about norms, about how we're going to work together. And that's where the structure riff is showing up. Sometimes it can be about the topic that the group is exploring, whether it's, you know, architecture or roadmap or prototype features or whatever. So all of those, it requires us to separate the topic from the structure. So the topic becomes somewhat, it doesn't really matter when we're looking at structure. but that's one of the gifts of structure. It can also be can be a little bit challenging to look at that as well. I'm curious if anybody else has something that they would share or a question that you have as you're trying to create your structural story or tell your structural story.
I was working through two. I think one you answered when you answered Brian's. The first one was one I offered at the beginning, which is if someone's very focused on their perspective, that they're not hearing the other's perspectives in the room. They're not necessarily being open to them. Just kind of keep talking louder when that other perspective is offered. So I don't know if that kind of falls under that move. I don't know if it's like a move opposed to kind of the same thing, like counter.
It might. It also, Kathy, might be just serial moving.
Oh, okay.
Like if somebody is, if I keep talking over top of you, and then I just keep introducing new things, and I'm not allowing your input to factor into anything that's happening in the conversation. So I'm not following you. I'm certainly not bystanding.
Right.
I am making moves, and we could also make a hypothesis. We'd want to test that. We'd want to test all of this. So we're not, we don't have all the right answers to everything, but we'd want to test it. So it might be that somebody's making multiple moves and not voicing an oppose. So I could have an oppose to what you're suggesting, and I just don't create space for it. And rather than oppose you, because that would be rude, why would I oppose you? I will just keep making moves.
Right. Okay.
If my daughter doesn't want to talk about the SAT test scores, all of a sudden there's way more important things to talk about that just keep introducing themselves into the conversation. So that's a hypothesis. Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. That's something I'll kind of run through those scenarios. And the other one I was sort of looking at was like when you're in a session and you have the move, and people are like, hey, yeah, great idea. We're going to do that. But in the move of, okay, who owns this? There's no ownership. And so is that sort of ownership like a bystand then?
Say that, say that dialogue again.
So, it's a conversation, and I'm not quite sure exactly how it plays out, but there's a conversation of this is the action we're going to take. Yep, this is the action we're going to take. Everybody's it's move, follow. Like, yep, we're all in agreement. And then it's like, great. So the action is owned by, you may state the group or whatever, and there's no taking that ownership. So I'll have to play through that if that's it's not an oppose. Maybe it's sort of a bystand.
It might be an unstated oppose.
Okay.
Again, because I think if you have what appears to be follow, but then nothing happens,
I see.
That's data.
Yeah.
Then I get really curious about. So the question then becomes, we'll talk about this in a moment, but since we're on this and it's a good opportunity to bring it up. Once you have a hypothesis about the pattern that might be happening, the next task is to test it out. And so a way to do that might be in the next session to revisit and say, so I could bystand and say, I noticed last time we did this, and we did this, and I'm noticing that there's been no action taken. So I'm curious, what has us not take action? Or I'm curious, who has a concern about the actions that we identified last time? So in that questioning, I am starting to test, I am making an assumption that somebody has a concern, and I'm inviting it. And I think finding, particularly when oppose is the action that's not getting voiced, finding ways to make it okay, normalize that somebody here certainly has one, or just create a facilitated exercise that surfaces all the reasons why this is risky. Like anything that you can do as a facilitator or coach to test that hypothesis. Now, if somebody goes, no, we just didn't have time. Well, now I've also have my answer. So now I've tested my hypothesis about, like, do we have an, do we really have an unstated oppose here? And we just need to very specifically call for it? Or did something else happen? All of it's data, and either way, we're going to learn. So it's a really good way to like be curious about something, go, oh, interesting, we keep doing this, or I noticed this happened. It's all data. And then how can you test it?
Great, thanks.
Thanks for sharing. Yeah, thanks for sharing. Okay, let's go. So step number one, you've got to take the moral story and turn it into a structural one. Because in doing that, that alone can be the action to sort of help you drop your just natural judginess about it. We aren't going to intervene well if we are irritated by something. We just don't show up as our best selves. So part of this is starting to separate the behavior from the actions that are taking place. And can you look at just the structure and lower the stakes for yourself if the stakes have risen? And there's, you know, a couple of examples in your handout about other moral stories. I think it's helpful to ask the question about what role might I be playing and what can I take? So there's some reflection places in your book. And then on page 20, the second one is to look for stuck patterns. So as part of telling that structural story is what is the pattern that's showing up in that conversation, or what's my hypothesis about it? And then step 3, and this is on page 21. So this is my caveat, is attend to your mindset about what can you do to change this. So I think there are places where you might interface with teams, or you might interface with another individual where there isn't positive intent. I think those are edge cases. And I think there are lots of reasons why they can happen, but there are edge cases in this world. There are people who do not hold positive intent, who are not interested in figuring something out or moving forward. And so to try to intervene or focus on conversation or have better conversations, or you show up in a way that brings your thinking or your vulnerability into that conversation. So this is just my public service announcement, my yellow flag of conversations are a key part of everything that we do. I think there's a lot that can be done to intervene, and just be mindful. There are edge cases where there isn't positive intent, or you just don't stand to change the situation. I was at a networking event about a month ago, and I was in this small group conversation, and what was happening was I had asked a question and of this person, and they responded in a way that answered nothing of what I said. So I knew in that moment that structurally we were talking past one another. We were talking about different things. We were focused on different topics, and I was making a move and the person was making an entirely different move. And it was in that moment I thought, I'm not going to see this person again. I really would like the answer to my question, but there's 5 other people here and other people need to take turns. And I just made a choice to go, like, it's fine. I don't need to engage in this. And I knew structurally that we were so far off that it would have taken a lot of words for us to get more aligned in order to really get out of that conversation what I was hoping for. So I just made the decision, you know, to move on and just thank him for the response. Somebody came up to me afterwards and said, what did you just do back there? Because I watched you go from being so engaged to then just this like wall came down, and you just abandoned that conversation, just did it so skillfully. And I said, I didn't really think about it, but what was happening for me in that moment was I knew structurally there were no amount of words that I could have used in that short period of time to get us back on the path towards moving forward. And it just didn't matter. Like, I wasn't going to see the person again. So anyways, I share both of those as a way to say, watch for edge cases. Not everything requires an intervention, and just be really mindful about the situation and your role that you play in that. So that's my public service announcement. And then on page 22, is this idea about intervening. And so there are some prompts that are just kind of giving you some handholds down at the bottom about ways that you as a facilitator could prompt for that. But the goal is, and Kathy, you had a really, great example, because it's about what's the hypothesis, and then what could you do to prompt for it or bring it yourself. So Kathy, in your example, that was a good example of how you might prompt for opposition. You could also go back, depending on your role in that conversation, and you could actually bring opposition. You could say, I'm going to be the one that voices, that particular concern or that pushback the next time around. So yeah, so I'm just going to pause here. What's coming up for you as you think about these moral and structural stories? Yeah, Brian.
Okay, I want to just pause right here, okay?
Yeah.
This stuff right there is gold. So whenever I've got my folio open, I've got my facilitator guide on one side, and I have these questions on the other side. And the reason for it is if you want to move group dynamics, this is how you do it. You diagnose what's happening in the room, what is the structure, and then you invite the other that's not there into the room. And the way that you do that is by these questions. And so this, if you're going to take one thing away from this workshop, I would take these things right here, because this is really how you channel group dynamics. So you're observing what's happening in the room. If they get into some serial moves, it's like, okay, what do? We invite a follow. Now, let me just share how this shows up, really in the nitty gritty. Okay. So not too long ago, I got master certified as a facilitator. And when you do that, you go before, a board of folks, and there's, fellow people who are trying to get certified in the thing. And you have to do a demonstration. And in this demonstration, what happens is that there is somebody who is in the audience that you're facilitating, a participant who, works for the certifying board, and they are there to be a disruptor. They are there to throw stuff in the works, right? Just to see if you can handle it, okay? So I'm doing my thing, I'm facilitating, I'm doing my demo, and this guy says, yeah, what exactly gives you the right to stand in front of us and facilitate? This is a really interesting question, isn't it? I have, and this
Can
is
I
what
pause
got me
you?
out of that. Yeah, sure, go for it.
So what's the structure of that?
What's the structure? Exactly.
What was that?
Oppose.
With some, I would call it an oppose with some high stakes, because it's got a lot of undercurrent to it. Maybe that's the best way to say it. Yeah. What
So in
gives you
chat,
the
we're seeing a couple. Yeah, what gives you the right? So in chat, we're seeing a couple people say oppose, right?
Yeah.
Now, here's what I could have done. I could have opposed right back, and I could have said, well, this, and then it would have gotten into a food fight back and forth. So here's what I did. I actually invited a follow to that guy. We'll call him Bob, right? I invited a follow. I said, Bob, thank you very much for sharing that. I can see where you might be coming from that. I'm wondering who agrees with Bob. That was inviting a follow. Does anybody agree with Bob? Okay. A couple hands go up. Okay, great. So maybe you think that I'm not the guy. That's fine. I'm not everybody's person. Who disagrees with Bob? So I invited an oppose in this case. Does anybody disagree with what he said? So I'm inviting an oppose to oppose. But what I'm doing there is that I'm taking the energy and I'm channeling it right back onto the audience. And the way that I did it, back onto the participants, the way that I did it was absolutely following this model. So in high stakes, this is your get out of jail. This is absolutely the way that you can channel the energy that's in the room and make it do what you want to do. So again, if you take one thing away from this, this is it.
Yeah. Yep. And Brian, I love that story. Yes, thank you. I love it, because transforming how not just groups make space for oppose, but I think how we make space for oppose is often the work to do. Because I think what happens when oppose So there's the challenge of not having opposed voice in conversations. And as you see by the group dynamics patterns, that's a dominant pattern, at least in American business. It's a very strong pattern. Where I think we've kind of managed oppose out of our conversations in general. But there's also the version of what happens and how do we treat it when it does get voiced. Because I think that's also what contributes to oppose staying out of the room. So when we put it in the parking lot, or when we make it wrong, or when we get offended, or we get triggered in some way by it showing up, then we don't invite it again. We do things that do not invite somebody to ever do that again. So I will just say, like, now, because I've worked with so many teams and I've watched the pattern where oppose is outside the room constantly, and teams work for months to build that muscle of actually bringing oppose, voicing it and bringing it in the room, that now for me, when I hear things like what Brian just shared, I get excited because I'm like, okay, we're off to the races here. Because now I don't have to work to bring the oppose in the room. The oppose is here. And now my job is to follow it. And if I don't follow it, it's going to go away again in some form or fashion, either in a spectacular fashion, like if Brian, if you had gotten defensive about that or opposed back, that could have gone entirely differently. Yeah. So oppose, I think, really sits at the crux of all of this. Teams will have different actions that they lean on more. There will typically be at least 2 of those actions that teams do more, and at least 1 or 2 of them that they do less. And it just becomes a pattern. If you really listen to a group dynamic pattern over time, you'll find that teams will have ways of using these and not using them in a pretty consistent way. And so then the task becomes, how do you make it okay for the other actions? What questions are here? We've covered a lot. Yes, darling.
I'm gonna like bombard with questions. So the balancing, okay, so I understand the balancing the oppose. I guess I'm thinking about someone opposes, right? So you balance. So you could use like a follow, right? A follow and then another general oppose. I guess it's on a case by case basis about what to do next is my assumption.
It is, and I would say a good place to start is how curious can you stay about what somebody is saying, and that curiosity will come on that bystand and follow line. So I think about structurally when oppose gets voiced. I'll give you an example. So there was a team, this has been a number of years ago, there was a team I was working with, and their oppose had gone offline. And there was an individual who was refusing to come to meetings anymore. It was an engineering team, and they were trying to meet collaboratively, and one person was having no more of it, just didn't want to be invited to any more meetings. And so there was a coach that had been called in to support that team and couldn't figure out why the team was having such a difficult time getting people to come together. So did a survey, collected some data. At the very end of all of that was that person that didn't want to come to meetings anymore held a different point of view about the direction the team chosen to go, felt like they were not heard in conversations. They had opposed and had been silenced. And so the viewpoint was, just tell me what you want me to do and I will do it. And I don't need to come and waste time. If you don't care what I have to say, then why would I waste the time to come to the conversation and offer my viewpoint? So all of that kind of team breakdown happened because his voice wasn't appreciated. And so the intervention for that was coming back together as a team, identifying, really starting with pros and cons, but focusing on what was at risk with the particular architecture, and just using a facilitated exercise to welcome the opposed from everyone. And what that did was it essentially set up the rest of the group to create some follow. So it wasn't just that the opposed got voiced, it was the opposed got voiced and followed in different ways. I see the risk from this particular point of view, or I see the risk and I see that risk and this risk. And so now all of a sudden, it's not so much about that particular individual having his way or being right about it. It was being heard. And through that process, they were able to go back to meeting together. But that was just a really poignant example of how oppose had been managed out, and then the team had to work to bring it back in.
Starling, how well does it answer your question? Thumbs up. Okay.
Yeah, really well, thank you.
Marsha, can I suggest a way forward just for the time that
Yeah.
we've got? Mostly
Yeah.
because Christina's fallen asleep, and I don't want to see that. So I want to be sensitive. It's like 2 a.m. for her right now, you know, poor Christina.
Oh gosh.
So how about just as a way forward, can you walk us through the rest of what's in here?
Yeah.
Take a couple of questions, and then what I'll say is that let's turn off the recording. And then, do you remember the script that you spot checked for me a while back?
Yeah.
And I still have that. So how about
Okay.
we do that as
Sure.
kind of a live practice after we turn off the recording? Sound fun?
Yeah, that sounds good.
All right. So why don't you walk through the rest of what's in here? Okay.
So the rest of what's in here is just a gift to you. I would invite you into self-reflection. So there will be one or more of these actions that is strong for you, and likely one or more of the actions that is least used for you. So I said to you, bystander is my strongest, oppose has been my least used. So there is an excerpt from my book called Building Your Model for Leading Change. And these are just reflection pages. So if, for example, so Brian's on follow. So if follow isn't one that you suspect is high for you, there's just some journaling prompts. So it's just a gift. And they're an invitation to do some self-reflection. And there's a couple of pages that are colored in green that are ways to practice expanding your repertoire around bringing those actions. So for example, on page 29, if oppose is something that you find challenging, there's some examples of how you might practice to bring it in more. So I just would say it's a gift, and you can practice and reflect on your own. I think that working with structural dynamics is a self journey, as well as a reading the room group journey. So a lot of this will come from you reflecting on yourself. Where do you get triggered? What are the action patterns that trigger you? Again, I've shared with you my two are when serial moving is present, or when covert opposition is present. And I can sense it. Those two patterns I really have to watch for, because if I'm not paying attention to my own frame of mind around it, I can easily get triggered by it, which then puts me into high stakes, and now I'm not helpful to anybody. So the rest is just a gift.
Okay.
Yeah.
My final questions for Marsha. Questions, comments, insights, queries, posers, takeaways. All right, let's give Marsha a big NOVA Scribes. Thank you very much. Marsha, it's great to have you back. Don't be a stranger.
Thanks. Yeah.
And we'll do this again sometime.
Yeah. Thank you.